Fernando Perez is an associate professor of statistics at UC Berkeley. But maybe a little known fact about him is that when he came to Berkeley, he was a neuroimaging researcher and spent some time in the brain imaging center at Berkeley, procrastinating on brain imaging by creating all these fantastic systems for interactive computing, including Jupyter. And he'll tell us all about those things today. Take it away, Fernando.
Well, thank you, first of all, Ariel and Tal and the organizers of the NeuroHackademy. I was part of the NeuroHack Week 2 years ago in Seattle, and there's actually some slides there from that event that I really enjoyed, and it's a pleasure to come back, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I have the Q&A open in a window, so folks should feel free to sort of drop things in there and interrupt me, and I'll do my best to sort of hop around between the presentation and any questions that come up. So don't be shy about kind of popping in a timely question. I'm happy to stop and take a look. As Ariel indicated, I'm faculty at UC Berkeley in the stats department. I'm also a scientist at LBNL. Just to give you a bit of a sense of where I come from, I did my training actually in physics. I was born and raised in Colombia. My PhD was in particle physics at CU Boulder. And I actually spent a lot of my time procrastinating in various ways there. IPython, which was sort of the seed of a lot of what I'll be talking about in my part, was me procrastinating on a dissertation. And obviously, if you live in Boulder, you should procrastinate in the mountains nearby and the kind of playgrounds that you have there. But I also spent a lot of time working in the scientific Python ecosystem in its early days. And so my postdoc was in applied math, doing algorithmic development for PDEs, mostly for multidimensional PDEs. And this was at a time when NumPy, well, when numeric was actually the predecessor to NumPy, was the tool we all used, and SciPy, Matplotlib was just being born. And that actually connected me to the world of neuroscience, as Ariel indicated. People like Jared Millman and Matthew Brett and others were trying to build up an open source stack for neuroimaging based on Python at the time. They invited me to Berkeley and I made connections there. In 2008, I came to the Brain Imaging Center there where I met Ariel. I actually connected with teams like JB Pauline and Gal Barocco, who are obviously staples of this community to this day. And I was also part of creating the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, which was founded at UC Berkeley back in 2013. And then eventually I kind of settled doing mostly fairly still computing focused work in statistics, though my application domain, I've shifted interest from brain imaging more into this kind of thing and trying to work on problems in the cryosphere, basically looking at the ice on Earth and applications in geoscience more at large. So a little bit closer perhaps to my physics roots and my passion for the mountains, but I'm still very much interested in the development of tools, and I spend a lot of my time working on software, on software, and not so much writing code anymore. Unfortunately, as much as I enjoy it, the reality of my life is that I don't write as much code anymore, but I want to take a step back from these experiences building tools like IPython and Jupyter and working in the scientific Python community to take for a moment a big picture perspective of open source software that when we talk about open source software, of course, the word software is right there in the middle. But I like to use an analogy to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you will. And this is a bit of a nod to UW, where Ariel works, because Bill Howe from the eScience Institute was the one who put me on to sort of abuses of Maslow's pyramid for problems in software and data science. But I think it's actually not a bad idea, not a bad way to look at the problem of the fact that impactful, significant open source scientific projects actually in practice end up going far beyond the code, and we often focus on all the technical pieces of the code. But I think an event like NeuroHackademy is a good place to take a moment and look at the bigger picture. And that bigger picture is that services and content that the software powers and sort of propels into a domain community are probably what actually matters to most people. They're sort of the tip of the pyramid for many, many people, and that's okay. I like to build tools. I enjoy writing code, even if I don't write as much of it as I used to. But for many people, what they come for is services and content, and we'll explore that a little bit more. And I would like to argue, and I think in Project Jupyter, we've taken time to show the value of these ideas, that impactful software happens also when communities take the time to take a step back and ask which ideas their implementation represents, and to pull those ideas away from the implementation and to actually build from those ideas open standards, open protocols, open references, kind of layers that others can implement independently, where others can build new new versions of software, for example, new approaches that interoperate, because that is what enables a community to develop and to grow, and an ecosystem of interoperable tools, and ultimately those ideas are developed, and the code are developed and supported by human beings, by a community of humans. And so I think taking this perspective that ultimately open source software is a lot more than software is actually useful. In our case, we can ask, for example, how these things are illustrated. For many people, Jupyter and IPython are basically either a terminal-based tool for interactive workflows, basically a shell, a very souped-up and fairly powerful, but still at the end of the day, a shell for Python, to run code, to run scripts, to play with a little bit of code, to open plot windows, or notebooks that are documents that can combine text and code and results. But oh, slides can't be seen. Sorry about that, folks. Did I not start? Oh, well, there you go. Despite doing Zoom every day of the week, for hours on end, I managed to start without sharing. How's that? Sorry, folks. Is that better? Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Somebody should have stopped me a little bit earlier. So very quickly, at least I'm going to show you the images that I was talking about, but I'm not going to repeat 7 minutes worth of talks. This was kind of the bit about me, about my past doing physics and applied math and having fun in the mountains, my time at Berkeley, starting in brain imaging up to today in statistics. And this was sort of the pyramid description of open source software as more than software that I was describing. And so to dig a little bit into that top layer, as I said, beyond the core tools of IPython and Jupyter, one of the things that we've seen has brought these tools to much broader impact in the community is actually the fact that we offer services that where people can focus on the content they're interested in. And so, for example, NB Viewer is a tool that allows you to give someone a URL that shows a rendered view of a notebook or even a full repository of notebooks, so that they can browse that content and read it and view it, not execute it, but view it without installing anything. NB Viewer was originally basically a web service implementation made by Matthias Buissonnier of something that Jupyter had at the command line. And we didn't fully appreciate how much of a barrier that was for someone to share their work, because if they had a Jupyter notebook on or IPython notebook at the time, on their laptop, and they wanted to share it with a colleague who wasn't using those tools, we figured, okay, well, we give you the conversion tools, that's enough. It turns out that Matthias created this little prototype of NB Viewer, a web service that he put up on a free Heroku tier over the course of a weekend that was effectively a lightweight web interface in front of a command line tool. And very rapidly, we saw a huge boon of people sharing their content on social media, of basically doing some work, doing some computations, doing an analysis, looking at some data, the companion analysis notebooks to a paper, putting it online and sharing those notebook links, those NB Viewer links with with users, and that actually had a huge impact. So in terms of penetration into a community, of having impact into a domain community for whom the tools are just that, they are tools, offering these services that allow access to content, and then the creation of that content, which obviously none of us would be an expert in, none of us in the core team would have been an expert in many fields, but that empowered others to share the content that was relevant to their communities, was hugely impactful for the project. And Binder similarly evolved from these ideas and these lessons into something that we'll talk more about later, but that also has helped us a lot. But obviously, running content and services is more than writing code. It requires an extra set of skills and has an extra layer of complexity and cost and management issues that require a project to think beyond just the software. Now, I'm skipping deliberately kind of the software layer, because in a sense, I think that's sort of the obvious one, that we'll return to it. But below the code, below the software, as I said, we've taken time in Project Jupyter to sort of abstract and generalize our ideas. And a good example is what we've done with the basic notion of interactive computing, of typing something at the IPython shell and getting an answer back. When we started building tools like the predecessors to the notebook, actually, we took a look at what that process was and turned it into a proper protocol. And perhaps a useful way to think about what we've done there by creating standards is to look at how the web works. The web is based on a protocol called HTTP. There are servers and there are clients. You can serve HTTP and speak to those servers with a web browser, but you can also speak to an HTTP server with other things that are not a web browser, because HTTP is not only for surfing the web. It turns out you can build all kinds of services over HTTP, and today we have many examples of that. That's the value of a protocol, that having a well-specified communication mechanism between these two endpoints allows someone to develop new use cases that are not coupled to the original one. Now, separate to the protocol, there's what information do you transport on top of it, and how is that targeted at humans? For example, if you actually want to write HTML for human consumption, say through a web page, then that will be rendered as documents in a web browser. And in Jupyter, we sort of have something quite similar in that we actually specify the protocol for doing code execution, for returning results, for controlling an interactive computing process. It's a protocol based on sending JSON packets back and forth over sockets that are run by a 0MQ networking library, which is a C++ library that we realized met very well the kind of design patterns we had in mind, and was easily usable by any programming language. But the point is that protocol is independent of notebooks or documents or anything else. It's a low-level protocol to connect execution processes together, and we use it in many parts of Jupyter. Now, if it turns out that this is part of an interactive session where you want a document, then the document format itself is also a standard that others can use and can build new tools on top of it. Now, this protocol, once we make it an actual sort of standard, we can say, well, this is not just about Python. We may be mostly Python users, and most Jupyter users use probably Python because there are other tools in other ecosystems. But the protocol can be implemented in Julia. It can be implemented in R. It can be implemented pretty much in any programming language that you want. Modulo meeting basically the basic constraints of the protocol, which can be done in just about anything. Here's an example. Here's a couple of somewhat recent examples of implementations of the notebook of the Jupyter protocol in C++ to do interactive C++ computing. This is from the team at QuantStack on the right, and to do SparkQL, which is basically a query language, similar kind of a SQL-like query tool that runs on top of Spark. And so this is a lot of the value of actually taking the time to go beyond just one implementation, but actually forcing yourself to think through what an open standard does, which is that it enables others to build an ecosystem that goes far beyond your own tools. And as I mentioned, well, at the bottom, there's people. It turns out that people are a lot more complicated than machines. I probably don't need to explain that to a lot of neuroscientists. But one of the things we've done in Jupyter is we've taken a lot of time to formalize and structure our community, including things like writing governance documents. Right now, we're going through the process of actually reiterating on our governance model, because the project has grown even a little bit larger than we had perhaps anticipated years ago. But we have a model that used to be, when it was much smaller, based on the Python style BDFL model, Benevolent Dictator for Life model, that has been used in a number of open source projects. We've learned that is limiting for a project of the scope and richness and diversity of stakeholders that Jupyter has. Today in practice, Brian Granger from Cal Poly and Amazon and myself act as co-directors of the project, but we actually have a steering council that has been elected and nominated. We have a model for institutional partner participation. I'll come to that question in a second. And we have, let me enlarge here out just a little bit so I can open, where's my, here we go. So that companies can connect with the project, and large institutions, also like universities, can kind of formalize the process of engagement. We have mechanisms for sponsors and funders to provide resources to the project, including how fiscal issues will be managed, which is done by a nonprofit organization called Focus, which serves as an umbrella organization for many scientific open source projects, Jupyter included. And having a proper governance model enables you to scale in human directions in ways that a repository on GitHub is not sufficient. To answer the question of how can people contribute to Jupyter's development, perhaps the best way to do so is to go to the website, which is at jupyter.org, and show you some of the links that are there. So in particular, in terms of kind of joining the community conversation, I would say that obviously there's code on GitHub, but for general discussion, probably the best starting point, I would say, would be the Jupyter Community Forum, which is at discourse.jupyter.org. And it's a place where questions can be asked about Jupyter on any topic. It's this grew, our discourse forum grew out 2-3 years ago, maybe, partly as a response to the fact that we were starting to develop a lot of mailing lists for different topics and different subtopics, and there was always this tension between if we have a different topic, do we make a new mailing list or threads within an existing one? And Discourse emerged as a solution for that, which I think has been quite successful in terms of giving us the ability to have both a single location for community-wide discussions while having good categorization and the ability for people to watch the topics they care about and ignore others, etc. So in terms of questions and connecting with the community, that may be probably the best place to start. And I'm happy to get into more specifics if this did not answer your question to satisfaction. So please let me know in the Q&A if you'd like a little bit more detail. So as I said, by having a more managed, formally managed community, one of the things that this enables us to do is actually engage with the kind of stakeholders that we have in I think a healthier way. Jupyter today is a project that has had probably over 1,500 and counting. That number is actually a little outdated, so it may be closer to perhaps to 2,000 today. Community volunteers who have contributed in a huge variety of ways, and they come from many places. There are people who are academic scientists like myself and others, obviously in an event like the one we're having today. There are people who are focused strictly on education. There are many industry participants. I mentioned that even our co-director is now at Amazon, even though he used to be in academia, he's now at Amazon. We have folks from Google, from Microsoft, from Netflix, from Anaconda, from Bloomberg. There are participants from government. There are folks in media and journalism. All of these different stakeholders are, first of all, they're the ones who deserve all the credit. If that wasn't clear, I want to make it sure that it's absolutely crystal clear to everyone here that none of this is my work, and everything I'll be talking about today is the outcome of team effort. And I want to emphasize that because in academic contexts, I think we are overly obsessed with the hero narratives of the single investigator, and that this is translated in authorship issues that I'm sure many of you in this event have had to deal with. And I think that's a problematic aspect of science. I love scientific research and I enjoy the academic world very much. That's the reason why I've stayed in it. But it always bothers me that our culture and our incentive mechanisms are so overly obsessed with the notion of individual heroes, and make it difficult often to create healthy open teams that are really genuinely collaborative. And so we've put a lot of effort into that in Project Jupyter. I'm sure we have our failings and that none of it is perfect, but we at least do try to engage. And the fact that many of our stakeholders come from areas different from academia, I think helps kind of maintain a healthier balance in that regard. Now, to give kind of a complete perspective of the pyramid, it is important to recognize that, of course, we do care about software, and in fact, we want our software to be extensible. To be actually, let me check something real quick. Yes, let me skip that slide. That was an accidental duplicate. I'll clean it up before I post the slides for later for the event. We want, importantly, open source software, high impact open source software of the kind that I think is worth investing your effort into should be extensible, because it's often the greatest value of a tool will often come from someone who does something different with it than what you had in mind or what you intended. And if you design it to be extensible, that is much easier. The original IPython Jupyter notebook was effectively a tool to let you access through the web text, math, code, and their results, and to share those combined assets, reproduce them, re-execute them, etc. As I said before, based on this protocol that we created and as a standardized document format. But over time, the classic notebook application, the one that maybe many of you are familiar with, evolved to have not only notebooks, but actually to have a file manager, because you need to know what to click on and where to find your files. It turns out that if you've ever clicked on the little new menu on the top right, you can open a terminal emulator in there. You can open a text editor to access files. All of these things have nothing to do with notebooks, and yet they are necessary if you're using, for example, a notebook server on a remote machine. You actually want these things. They were added to the system because we needed them, not because we simply wanted to add features, but because our workflows and those of our users showed that we needed them. So over the years, the lessons from that evolved into a tool called JupyterLab, which is effectively today our new user interface for using the Jupyter tools, which is sort of a unified theory of Jupyter. This has been a very large team effort over the last few years that has combined folks from the team and from the original team in academic environments and the open source community, with big participation, especially from Bloomberg and Anaconda. Now some of those folks are actually at AWS and other companies, but it's been a big, long-running team effort. Right now, the team is getting very close to version 3.0 release, and the point of JupyterLab was to build a user interface that is extensible, that is modular, and that takes all of those core tools that were in the protocol, in the standards, and how to represent computation and data that I spoke about, and actually expose them as user interface elements. In here, for example, we can take a look at a notebook on the left part of the interface, but that notebook has an interactive widget whose display view is actually simultaneously visible on the right, so that, for example, you could have a long, complicated document where you're looking at different data sets, but you want to manipulate some of the controls in different side views, and they remain completely linked. As you can see there, they remain linked to the main computational space. Beyond notebooks, in Jupyter, we can have, in JupyterLab, and we'll see a little demo of this later on, we have things like markdown files. We have things like web consoles that are not notebooks, but that are still effectively full-blown interactive kernel environments that use our same protocols. data is a first-class citizen, and we'll take a look at this. We'll take a look at this in a minute in a demo. And that data is reusable within code. If you have a way to view your data, for example, and you build a plugin to view your data, you can actually call that exact same view as an object in your code. So the point is, there shouldn't be a distinction between a graphical interface and something that you can control programmatically, which I think is important for reproducibility reasons. Things that can be scripted, that can be controlled by code, are easier to version control, they're easier to track, they're easier to include in reproducible workflows than strictly a combination of actions that you took in a graphical interface. At the same time, it is useful to have clickable browsers, graphical parameter controls, etc. And so we try to offer tools that let you have both, that let you have the right graphical tools when that's valuable, but also that give you programmatic control when you want it. And as I said, it's meant to be extensible. And this was a lovely example of 2 years ago, after I gave effectively a version of this talk, three developers at NeuroHackademy came back the next day with a Nifty viewer that they built as a little plugin so that you could click on a Nifty file and view it inline. I don't know what the current status of this plugin is. I honestly didn't ran out of time to check to see if I could install it. But they developed it in 24 hours. So Anisha Keshavan, Nate Back, and Chris Gorgolewski last year, after I gave my talk on I think a Monday morning or afternoon, by Tuesday afternoon, this is a picture at UW, taken at UW 2 years ago. I'm sorry, in 2018. They were ready, and they had a version of this embedded Nifty viewer running and connected to the JupyterLab interface. The actual JavaScript Nifty viewer existed. It was a third-party tool that existed. So what they did was they wrapped it basically within the necessary fairly thin wrapper that was needed for JupyterLab to understand it and to connect it to the file browser, etc. But the point of this is to illustrate that this is the kind of thing that can be done in a hack week, in a day, and that can give you a useful tool that becomes part of your workflow. This is a more sophisticated tool that I think will be relevant to this community. So the question, can JupyterLab be integrated in other Python IDEs? Well, more than JupyterLab being integrated in other Python IDEs, in a sense, it can be used. Our focus is not to be an integrated development environment. Our focus is not software engineering. It does have and we'll see it in a minute, it does have text editors, it does have file managers, it has a number of IDE-like tools. If you have a favorite IDE that you prefer running and it runs through the web, you can run it side by side with JupyterLab. Our focus is in sort of interactive data analysis, interactive data science, data exploration. I'll show a little bit of what this Fruit Fly Brain tool is for. But having sort of an IDE inside of another IDE would be probably pretty difficult, and most IDEs have their own complete architecture. But what is possible is to run, more so than within JupyterLab, to run inside Jupyter Hub, which we'll see, which all of you have access to a Jupyter Hub, and we'll see a little bit later. To run inside Jupyter Hub tools beyond JupyterLab. So it is possible to run inside of Jupyter Hub, for example, RStudio. It is possible to run other editors. I don't know if PyCharm, for example, runs through the web, but I do know that VS Code, for example, can be run, and there are folks who use it through the web interface. As far as sort of putting two IDEs, one IDE inside of another, that would probably be a little bit more complicated and perhaps a little bit weird. I hope that answers your questions, but if not, please always elaborate and I'll try to return to it. So JupyterLab's extensibility was demonstrated to me in a really lovely way last year when I visited Colombia and met with Aurel Lazar, who works on fruit fly neuroscience. And there may be some of you who have interacted with the Lazar lab at some point in your careers or know of their work. This is a little video of a tool that they developed, which I found to be a fantastic illustration what they've done in terms of sort of embracing these ideas. What you have here is a JupyterLab interface. There's a notebook up here, but on the bottom left panel, you have a WebGL 3D rendered version of both overall brain anatomy in the fruit fly and of neuronal circuits. And it turns out that some of the things the Lazar team works on is taking these neuronal circuits that are anatomically represented here. Let me play that again for a second. And simulating those circuits as electrical circuits. And then they actually have custom simulation code that runs on GPU clusters to run the equivalent electrical simulations of the activity of those circuits. But they also have databases that access, I think, genomic and proteomic data or about the fruit fly and that is relevant to those specific circuits. And for that, they have a custom database and they have a custom viewer and browser. And so what they've done is they've been able to integrate all that together within the same environment, so that effectively they get the basic tools that JupyterLab provides, but in addition to those basic tools, they actually now have a lot of custom tools that obviously no one in the general sort of JupyterLab team and Jupyter community would have ever thought of developing, but that are extremely relevant to them. So this one is obviously not a one afternoon hack. The way the wrapping of, I think the name of that nifty viewer is Papaya, if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure, I could be wrong. The way the wrapping of the Papaya viewer was kind of a one afternoon hack for 3 very talented developers. I wouldn't do it in an afternoon, but they did. But this is I very much like the fruit fly brain lab as an illustration of the sort of the power of domain scientists embracing an extensible tool and beginning to build a custom interface that still gives them access to the rest of the ecosystem so that they don't have to be building sort of everything else, which is in a sense a little bit of a parallel, I think, of what has happened to many scientists by using Python itself, right? For us, for many years, we've said that one of the advantages of Python is precisely that it is a general purpose programming language that has a big community, say in web services, in parsers, in other areas, so that scientists don't have to maintain all that. And the scientific community has been able to focus on tools like NumPy and SciPy and Matplotlib and IPython and more domain specific tools like say NiPy or scikit-learn that are specific to either algorithmic issues like machine learning or even domain-specific issues like NiPy, but well, we can leave the business of running a programming language to the people who are interested in that and who are experts at running a programming language, which is the core Python community. And that creates then the ecosystem of other tools that we may need. So we may need a web server in Python, but we don't have to write a web server. We can just use it because there's another community that does that. And so I think with JupyterLab, we're trying to kind of play an equivalent game where we provide something that is very usable for a lot of everyday tasks in data science and computation, but that is also extensible by domain experts in the way that I just showed. So let me try to show you a quick live demo of JupyterLab, where first I want to show sort of the basic interface. When you open JupyterLab, this is running, I think, the most current version. Let's take a look. Yeah, 2.2.1, which is the current version of JupyterLab. You still have notebooks, and so in here I can still type. I meant to type this. So if you type a little bit of Python code, it still works. You get plots, etc., the way you would do in a normal notebook. The actual file format of a notebook is unchanged in JupyterLab. It is just a different user interface on top of the standard. You still have Markdown in here, so Markdown titles, code blocks, import NumPy as a code block still works, and math works. right? Everything, sort of everything that you expect in a normal notebook still works. There are certain things that that work much nicer. For example, you can copy a couple of cells and say, let's have a new notebook, and then you can paste groups of cells between notebooks and manage content, for example, in two different notebooks, cut and paste, restructure multiple documents, the kind of tasks that tended to be a major pain in the neck in the classic interface, because moving and restructuring content in complex notebooks across instances was not at all easy. And in the current, with JupyterLab, the tasks of that nature are very easy. But as I mentioned, let's say, that we have this. Let me close that notebook. If I right-click on this, I can ask for a new console for this notebook. This console is not a notebook. This is a lightweight user interface. Think of it like an IPython terminal, but that is connected to the same underlying notebook process. And so if in here I say X, I look at the first 10 entries of X, I see that they are there. If I plot X, I see this is the same exact X that I was looking at here. If I say X is equal hello, and now I look at X in here, X is hello, right? So you can think of this as the notebook is a document, but it's a document that is connected to the state of a Python process, in this case, a Python 3 process, what we call kernel. And that process is what contains your data, your variables, and whatnot. This is another view of that same data, of that same process, but it doesn't have a document attached to it. It's just an append only. You type here and answers come back. The way I use this is basically similar to what I would do if I'm doing pencil and paper algebra in a derivation, and I want to try out if some way of doing something might potentially work, but I don't want to mess up my main derivation. I might grab a piece of scratch paper next to the notebook where I'm writing, meaning the physical notebook with a pen, with a fountain pen, and I grab a piece of scratch paper, and in my head, the data is the same. It's the same problem that I'm thinking about. I now have some scratch paper. I do what I experiment with something, and if it works, I go back and then I write it cleanly in the main document. So this gives me that kind of lightweight, scratchy experimentation that you would get, say, in an IPython terminal, but both with access to the richness of displays and graphics and interactivity that you get in the notebook, and with things like multi-line editing, etc., but without having to have it modify the document. So, for example, I know many people when you're working on a notebook constantly create scratch areas and keep adding and deleting cells basically to try things out. Well, if you're doing a lot of that, this is something that perhaps maybe more convenient. You can have just the console by itself. So this is a console that was, if you see this console has the name of the notebook, it is attached to the notebook, but it has a different icon because this shows that it's connected to that notebook, whereas this is just a standalone console that has nothing. X doesn't exist in here. It hasn't been created. It hasn't been defined. This is basically pretty similar to an IPython shell, which you can also have in here in a terminal, because this also gives you a terminal. And you can also open, obviously, IPython at the terminal. And X in this case, I think my default Python startup file, I think somewhere at some point I dropped an X equal hello, but nothing else has been defined. X, that's a little bit of an accident. And IPython, it's in my IPython startup file for some reason, some random experiment. But in here, this is only a terminal. I can't get a plot here. I can't get JavaScript. I can't get interactive controls. Whereas here, you have access to all of the protocols and the display machinery of Jupyter, but without the need to have a document attached to it. And so hopefully this illustrates sort of how those pieces of interactive computing are recomposed in this case in 3 different ways: in a terminal, in something that is basically like a sophisticated graphical terminal, and then a full-blown document environment. You can also have, let me close a few things for the sake of keeping sort of the screen simple. You can also You can also open something like a markdown file, but you can say, well, I actually would like to view this markdown file as a rendered file. And so let me put them down here next to each other. So this is an example of a markdown file that now is rendered here. And as you start using it, it begins to render, and it will render math, it will render the complete markdown file as you use it. So the point is to show you that when you're connected to a remote system, you can actually have a number of tools connected to one another, and the idea of having computations applies all the same to a file. So if, let's say, you want a new console, not attached now to a notebook, but attached to a document like a markdown file. In this case, there was no kernel that existed. This was just a text file. But now I can say, well, I actually would like to do some computations connected to what I'm writing in my LaTeX file or in my Markdown or Python script. So you can have now a console attached to this, and then if I highlight that code and I hit Shift Enter, it will send that block of code to the console, and I will get the results. I will get the results of that executed in that console. So again, just sort of showing you how the pieces can be connected and reconnected in different ways that can be valuable, and that begin hopefully to give you ideas of the kinds of tools that you might want to build for yourself. And as I said, data in JupyterLab is sort of a first-class citizen, and a lot of thought has gone into making it such. Let's start with something simple, a CSV file. Well, you could open it just with a text editor. This is what the classic Iris dataset looks like as a text file. But by default, JupyterLab ships with a CSV viewer that gives you a nice CSV view of that file, which is obviously much more human friendly than this. Now, what about a big CSV file? Let's open this one right here. If I open this big CSV file, I get a scroll bar with a small scroll handle, and if I take it to the bottom, this is a 1.17 million row CSV file, and yet it scrolls pretty smoothly. If you try, I actually just before this talk tried to open this CSV file in Excel. It took a sweet minute or two on my machine to open it, and it gave me a warning that the file had been truncated, and it was only able to open up until around here, like 1,050,000 files, rows, give or take. So it threw away like the last 10% of the file. I have no idea what internal cutoff Excel hit, but basically Microsoft's 30-year-old technical computing powerhouse for tabular data can't open this file. Images are accessible to you from the get-go, but you can build your own, and that's available from the very beginning. But an important point is that you can actually contribute your own viewers for your own file. So let's take, for example, this file. And open it in a text editor. It's called museumsndc.geojson. As a file on disk, this is what it looks like. But that file is a JSON file, so we can open it as JSON data. And so this now gives us a view of this file as JSON data, whose type is feature collection and which has 57 features. We have a little tree browser for JSON data that is very nice and very convenient. This uses the display machinery of Jupyter for displaying JSON and lets you navigate that much more easily. Perhaps we can look here for museum, and it'll highlight where the word museum in that data structure appears, and so you can find within that JSON data structure where museum appears. But this particular file, the GeoJSON schema, is a schema for encoding geospatial information in JSON files. So this is the raw JSON view as text. This is JSON as a hierarchical data structure, but without any specifics of what the JSON contains. And if instead we open it, I double clicked on it, which is that's the default view, or the richest of the viewers. If I open it as GeoJSON, then what we see is a navigable interactive leaflet map that recognizes what the bounding box of these coordinates is, does an overlay, and lets us navigate these data and actually look at what each of the objects in the data file is. This is arguably the way you probably would want to see this kind of data in most scenarios. And this is a small plugin that was written by a community member to look at GeoJSON data. Somewhat domain specific, so it's not included by default. It's perhaps not as domain specific as neuroimaging, but still it's geospatial data. So by default, JupyterLab will know how to show you obviously text and generic JSON. It won't know how to show you this, but it takes one command to install it, and you have that extension available to you. Now, one point that I want to mention is, well, this kind of JSON view is actually available to you. So if you say from IPython's display machinery import JSON, and you have a dictionary A that is, say, so A looks like this. That's A is a dictionary. I can take a look at A as a JSON object. Most Python dicts that don't have something too strange in them will convert cleanly to a dictionary. And so now you can have that same object view on any of your data structures, on any of your Python dicts, or obviously if they're JSON to begin with, you can display them just as is. And so this will find me. This will highlight where in the data structure the word hello appears, etc. So that same machinery, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the same machinery that is available in the graphical interface is actually built up from the underlying components that use what is called the Jupyter Display Protocol, which is something that we actually define. How do objects represent themselves in the output of computations, so that can be used in any code fragment. It can be used, and I deliberately did it here, not in the notebook, but in the console, so that you see that all of these tools are reusing the same exact machinery. And so I hope this gives you a bit of an overview of what the basic kind of extensibility and features of JupyterLab are, which you have available in your in the Jupyter Hub instance. And here I wanted to show something slightly more complicated. So just like you have a Jupyter Hub that you can log into, this was actually part of a demo that we were in this morning in a workshop on geosciences. As I mentioned, a lot of my work these days is connected to geosciences. And so here I'm running, just to highlight where this is running on my laptop, or well, my desktop machine. I'm working from home obviously now. So on my desktop machine, this is running on localhost. I have it installed. I opened the terminal and I typed JupyterLab and I got this, and these are files in my home directory that I have installed. This URL is actually at NCAR. For those, the URL is UCAR, but that's for administrative reasons. This is NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Which is administered by something called UCAR. That's why the URL is UCAR. And they maintain, among other things, supercomputing facilities for climate modeling, for climate simulations, etc. There is a project called the CMIP6 project, and the CMIP6 project is a project is a worldwide collaboration to compare the output of large-scale climate modeling simulations. So I can log into the NCAR supercomputers, request an interactive environment, and without actually having to do SSH from a terminal, manage anything else other than the fact that they do use two-factor authentication. So when I log into the web interface, it'll ping my phone for a 2FA authentication, and I can open a notebook such as this one that I'll show you in a minute to analyze and take a look at data on a very large scale from this project, from the CMEP6 project. That is the Climate Modeling Intercomparison Project in its sixth edition. What I'm doing here is I've logged into the supercomputer. It looks exactly the same as my laptop. The difference is that now I can create a distributed computing cluster using something called Dask. And Dask is a tool for doing high-level very easy high-level distributed parallelism. And so with Dask, I can connect to these nodes and begin to ask them to do work for me. In this case, I had requested 4 workers, each with 4 cores and each with 32 gigs of RAM. If I click on this little link, Dask actually has a little dashboard by default, it has a web server that has a dashboard. But I can actually view that. There is a plugin that allows me to see the output of these distributed computations through the local, within JupyterLab itself. So I can view, for example, what is happening with when I do distributed computing, what tasks are being used, where those tasks are. Right now, I'm not doing anything, so none of these plots produce anything quite yet, but I want to get them ready. As you can see, you can organize the interface with reasonable flexibility and ease. So I'm going to, in the interest of time and the fact that this is the purpose here is to demonstrate the kind of workflow that this enables, not to dig too much into the domain specifics or even into the technology. We're using a library called Intake to basically manage large-scale data catalogs. And Intake is integrated with JupyterLab, and some of the NCAR staff had already prepared the data loading. So never mind that error. It doesn't actually matter for our purposes right now. We can skip it. Because what we are going to do is we are going to take a look first at where in the world there have been contributions to this project. As I mentioned, this project is called CMEP, the Climate Modeling Intercomparison Project, where teams that do climate modeling all over the world contribute the output of their models, and then it becomes easy for the community to basically validate and look across. So this is just a simple HTML example of where that model data comes from. Now I am going to actually, this one will take a second to run. I am opening on the local system right now. That means on this machine. So this is a machine called Casper, where I am on their distributed parallel file system. So this is one of the supercomputers at NCAR. I am opening a data store that has the catalog for all of the output, or not all, because the full output is something on the order of 30 petabytes, the full CMEP output, but it's a catalog of a subset of that. And once I open it, I have a description of the data that is available there. I can view that description as a data frame, and I can basically begin doing sort of pandas style operations on it. And then in this case, we are going to do some processing of the data to extract some aggregate statistics. The point is here, when I hit Shift Enter and I begin running, now you see what's happening. The cluster springs to life, and then all of these nodes that we had allocated begin effectively doing things for us. So there's a fair amount of activity happening here, where as we run through as we ask this cell to execute, this is making calls to Dask, and Dask will give us real-time analytics on the code that was being done, and sort of real-time diagnostics. Sorry. What happened here? Oh, typo. So here I'm going to compute some mean properties of all the data across all of these nodes. I believe when we loaded this data, this was about 1.6 terabytes of data in total, and you saw it being. Okay, hold on a second. I remember something happened to that key. No. Okay, now I know what happened. I had a typo. I messed up that cell. So now this is computing on the entire data set. It's computing the mean along the time dimension. And later, once that cell finishes computing, we can do some visualizations. Obviously, let me cheat a little bit because that had been run already, so the output of the plots is already there. But you can see here the state of each one of the nodes, which tasks are being executed, and what kind of the data flow and the computational flow is across the entire cluster. This is extremely useful. Knowing when you're doing distributed computing, knowing which parts of your cluster are doing what, who's busy, who's not busy. Are you waiting because one node is busy and everybody else is idle, which means that you have a strange, highly non-parallel bottleneck? Are they busy all the time, or are they busy some of the time, but they're spending a lot of time, they're busy equally, but you see small amounts of CPU activity, and instead there's a lot of communication. It means you're transferring perhaps too much data. Maybe you chunked your data in a certain way, and it turns out the algorithm needs to chunk it in. The algorithm that you're currently running kind of uses the data, cutting across the grain, if you will. That's a very common issue in distributed computing. All of these issues can be very hard to diagnose. In this case, you have a real-time view into, in this case, one of the big supercomputers at NCAR. And then at the end, oops, I didn't mean to leave. One kind of fairly standard matplotlib call. Now that we did compute this in about 1 minute of wall time, now that we did compute this, will give us these plots on this 1.6 terabytes of climate data across the planet. So to me, this is a valuable illustration of the power of a domain-specific plugin, in this case for distributed computing, associated with the Dask library, whose first version was written at something kind of like a hack week, but a meeting that we had in Boulder, actually also in the summer of 2018, a meeting that we had in Boulder in combination with the Pangeo team, so folks from the Jupyter project and the Pangeo project, and Ian Rose, who at the time was working with me at Berkeley, started writing this little Dask plugin. So Dask is an independent project, and again, it got merged into, so the plugin got wrapped, not merged, but wrapped into being usable within JupyterLab, and now it's an extremely useful tool for doing interactively large-scale data processing and computing. So hopefully these two kind of quick demos show you sort of the value and the possibilities of the architecture that these tools offer for interactive data exploration, data analysis, whether you're doing it locally on your own machine with the tools that you have and the data that you have on your laptop, or whether you're actually running against one of the largest data sets we currently have in the world on one of the nation's biggest supercomputers, right? And the Jupyter Hub that you all have currently accessible from the Hack Week is is a flavor of something like this. It may not have exactly the CPU power of this machine in a combined sense, but for tasks like this, where you're doing something on a few nodes of a few tens of gigabytes of memory, that's the kind of CPU that is completely reasonable to deploy in the cloud. So you don't actually need a supercomputer for that. I want to stop for a second though and give credit to this demo to Anderson Banihirwe, who I'm probably mispronouncing Anderson's name. He's a software engineer at NCAR who effectively did this demo. We had a workshop this morning. I had planned a slightly different demo for today, and I liked so much Anderson's demo of JupyterLab that actually right after we finished this morning's workshop, which was around Jupyter and Pangeo and geosciences from a project called Jupyter Meets the Earth, we stayed on Slack and Zoom, and he helped me basically set up the demo so that I could run it myself. That's actually why I can't run one of the cells, because it requires access to that to a part of the file system that only he can run into. And he wasn't planning on setting that up for me, but he very kindly took the time to help me set up for this. And this particular demo is actually the code. If you're curious about what intake and Dask and these things do and how they work, this code is actually available up on GitHub, and I'll be happy to add links. I'll add a link to this before I share my slides, so that if you're interested or curious, you can take a look at them. But anyway, all the credit for that work goes to Anderson, not to me. So let me return. So we survived the live demo. So let me answer before I move on. Jessica Bartley has a question. It is indeed an amazing demo. I really loved it. That's why I scrambled this morning, and that's why my slides are still kind of half done, because I scrambled. I got excited and I scrambled to make it run. I will convey your compliments to the author, to Anderson, who's the one who deserves all the credit. The question is, what is the path to the notebook on the Jupyter Hub that has the same flavor as this demo? Oh, I may have not been very clear. I didn't mean that in your hub you had these same tools. What I meant to say was that the NeuroHub that has been set up for all of you has these kinds of capabilities. I don't know that there is a demo of this flavor and that uses Dask, and I didn't have time, because this idea occurred to me literally this morning. Eric Sindel, who has been working with Ariel and the team on the setup of your hub, is actually part of that other project, and he was there at the meeting this morning. So I'm happy to reconnect. Eric is probably asleep right now because he lives in Sweden, so he was there for our meeting in the morning, but I doubt he's around right now. But I'm happy to, after I finish, I'm happy to connect with Ariel and Eric and see if these Dask tools are installed. And if they're not, we may not be able to run this exact one, because obviously that one needs a very, very specific files, but we can certainly set up and share with you all a more lightweight version of the same idea, of something that basically uses Dask to run a distributed computation of this kind. And I'm sure within the next couple of days, we can make available a small demo that at least illustrates the computational pattern that I just showed, even if it's not with this exact same data set. So thank you for that question. I'll make a note of connecting on that. And Ariel, I would ask you to remind me to talk to Eric about that if I drop the ball. But let's make sure that happens in the next few days. Before I return to the slide deck, I'd like to ask if there are any other questions. Okay. All right, so let me take a sip of water. I've been talking for an hour, so let me pour myself a bit more water. And we will continue. So this is a quote. Up until now, we've been kind of extolling interactive exploration, typing code, playing, visualizing data, looking at all of these real-time outputs. I want to take sort of the counterpart of that question from a scientific perspective, which is reproducibility. This is a quote that I'm sure many of you have seen. If you've seen me talk about this topic ever, I've abused this quote 100 times. But I still use it because I think it's relevant. It has been actually the quote that motivated for me and kind of captured very cleanly the essence of many of the concerns I had with reproducibility. Excuse me, and that actually inspired some of the developments that we're going to talk about in the next for the next few minutes. So I still think it's relevant. It was written by David Donahoe and Buckheit. I don't know Buckheit's first name, faculty at Stanford. Donahoe is faculty in statistics. And this was actually part of the manual for a MATLAB toolbox called WaveLab for wavelets, for using wavelets in signal processing and sort of data analysis. And Wavelet and the two of them wrote an article called WaveLab and Reproducible Research. WaveLab was published, even though it was based on MATLAB, which is itself a closed source. WaveLab was open source. All the code was available. And they, as part of WaveLab, they shipped not only the code, the package, but actually a manual that had scripts to recreate every figure. And they defended that. In '95, this was a somewhat controversial opinion, and they defended it based on this argument, right? That you should provide everything that the reader needs to run your code. This is not really controversial anymore, but it's taken us quite a bit of time to get there. And by the way, Buckheit and Donahoe were actually paraphrasing some ideas that had been pioneered at Stanford by John Claerbout, who ran the Stanford geophysics, one of the Stanford geophysics groups, and had a very strict policy of making all of the work in his lab easily scriptable, reproducible, automatically executable. And his argument was actually not a sort of a philosophical or epistemological one. His argument was just a practical one. He always said, I don't want to have every PhD student who comes into my lab waste the first 2 or 3 years of their PhD effectively getting back up to speed with what whoever had just left the lab and graduated, or the postdoc who had left the lab 6 months ago had done, and then only having a year to do science at the end. But instead, I want them to be up and running by grabbing something that works, hitting run, seeing that it works, spending a few weeks or months, whatever, kind of understanding how it works, and then doing something new on top of it, rather than this constant reinvention of the wheel that happens in many labs. Now, today, we would like to add sort of a sentence to this, which is a place to run the code, not just sharing the tools, but actually making it viable to do that re-execution and that reproduction as quickly as possible. So first, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour into describing an educational effort inspired by this quote and by the work that we've done on this. This is a course that I taught at Berkeley. It was an upper division undergraduate cross-listed graduate course. I had a phenomenal instructor, one of our PhD students, Eli Ben Michael. And this was a course that tried to really get the students to absorb and embrace these kinds of ideas and the questions that I think that quote captures so well. We had students from all over campus. It was listed as a stats course, so obviously the majority were statistics students, but there was actually a pretty good representation of students from other disciplines, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, nuclear engineering PhD students, civil engineering, etc. And what the course tried to do was sort of hit the what, the why, and the how. The philosophical questions around what are the key what are the key ideas around reproducibility in terms of data, computation, analysis, and publication. So there were readings, etc. The why, sort of, I think there are actually important questions that are social, that are epistemological, and that are practical, that have both practical and ethical implications around reproducibility, around transparency in science, about societal access to research, that are important and that should be discussed, especially in the context of teaching undergrads. But also the how. A lot of the course was very, very hands-on. What are the skills and habits that you need to acquire to make this an everyday practice? And an important point was to make sure that this became something that you did regularly, rather than something that is, well, now I'm going to get this paper published and it got accepted. How do I make it reproducible? How do I share this better? Focusing on the sort of the how layer of the course, the practical skills and habits. We used obviously certain specific tools. Those specific tools were kind of centered around my personal preferences: Git, GitHub, Python, NumPy, Matplotlib, Sphinx, etc. I'm sorry, let me get out of this for a second because I want to fix. I realized that this was slightly misformatted, and I had dropped the bottom line, which is important because we're going to talk about it now. The point is, the specific tools that we covered, obviously you have to teach something concrete, but I want to emphasize in this context that they actually each of them represents an idea. It represents the Git and GitHub, or specific tools for version control, which is a core skill and a core idea of tracking your work across its evolution. Python is the language we use, but the point is to do your work in a programmable environment so that you can script it, so you can share the code with others, you can critique it, rather than doing everything in a GUI point-and-click environment. Process automation, we used Make. It's the simple, easy one, but you can do that with any other tool. The SciPy stack, the R stack, is just as valid. We use Sphinx for documentation. We use PyTest for software testing. But the point was testing as an idea that is part of the research workflow, not just for software engineers. Continuous integration, reproducible containers, etc. So it's important to focus, I think, on the left part of this column rather than too much on the concrete implementation. Though obviously the course happens in a concrete implementation. One important approach that I took in this course was to think of Git and Python as tools that we used everywhere, all the time. This was not a course where we learned Git by having many lectures on Git. We had a quick intro to the core ideas of Git, and I tried to give the students a very clear mental model of how Git operates, which is something that I've done in Hack Weeks in the past as well. Just finished teaching one a few weeks ago where we effectively reused an updated version of that tutorial. But the students, there were no Git exercises. The Git exercises was the class, right? They had to use it for everything. The entire course was delivered through Git websites, through GitHub repositories, through Git repositories hosted on GitHub that they had to clone, they had to operate with, they had to submit their work through that. And so it became an everyday tool for them, because I think of version control as the toothbrush and dental floss of computing. This is something that you should do every day. This is how you work. It's really a lot better than a root canal. And so instead of thinking of tracking your work or making copies of it every once in a blue moon, you just get used to doing it every single day. And it is, in the long run, a lot less painful, even if it takes a bit of time to get into the habit, as I certainly know trying to teach it to my 3-year-old. But for example, everything, the quizzes, the assignments, the projects, everything that they did every single day of the course, they had to use it. Now, another important idea was to get them and get the students into the notion that the work they are doing depends on things, and you should manage those dependencies explicitly. You should know what you depend on, because if you have explicit management of your dependencies, then it is much easier to actually replicate what you did, whether it's yourself 6 months later or to share it with someone else. So for that, we used Conda environments. The class was based on a specific Conda environment that every student had on their machine. As I said, we talked about automation and testing as core tools. We actually used lessons from software carpentry. I didn't write all of the content from scratch. I used lessons from others. The lessons on automation and Make at software carpentry are actually great. It's a really well-paced and really well-written tutorial. They also have some very good ones on testing and continuous integration. So I was very happy to be part of a community that has a lot of this content, which I reused. The students actually learned to make Travis part of their workflow. So for those of you who are not familiar, Travis is a tool for what's called continuous integration, which means systems that will run your code whenever something happens, and you get to specify what something means. It's a tool that comes a little bit more from the sort of software engineering industry rather than the scientific spaces. But Travis is a tool that can be extremely useful for science. And in this case, what we did was we set up the class repositories and the homework and whatnot so that they would run the tests in their code automatically every time they made a change. Those of you who are already heavily involved with open source software development are used to that, and you probably have already done that. But if you're not used to this, it's a great practice to get into. Once you've described your code and your dependencies, once you have automated processes with a tool like Make, once you have explicit tests that execute and validate your code, then you can tell the machine, you know what, every time I change anything, do all that for me. Because you've now scaffolded your project in a way that a machine can take it from there. And a machine can say, you changed this much, and those things that you said had to check out, don't check out today. Before you keep going, I'm going to let you know that so that you stop and take a step back, rather than 6 months later finding out, oh, shoot, we've been doing stuff for 6 months. And now that we try to put it all together, nothing works. And who knows what happened in the last 6 months? Good luck. Right? Instead, this can happen literally on every change that goes into the system. And so the students got used to writing tests so that every time there would be a new change committed into the GitHub repository, the system, not them on their laptop, but the system would automatically run those tests and would let them know what had happened. And so the class began with a real world replication effort. I told them, go find this repository, there's this paper. It happened to be an atmospheric science paper. The authors of this paper had put next to the paper, which was published in an open access journal, they had put up a website, a GitHub repository that had notebooks and code and whatnot to supposedly recreate the results of the paper. And indeed, it was very nicely done. These were authors who actually had, if you compared what was on the paper and the notebooks that were available on GitHub, it was basically the same thing, right? These were authors who did basically the best that you can expect. And interestingly, it didn't quite replicate. There were weird, small, tiny issues because they hadn't fully listed their dependencies. And in the interim, and the paper was at the time 6 months old, something had already changed in a library. And there was a very, very subtle issue that actually took the core Matplotlib developers jumped in. Tom Caswell, who's the lead of Matplotlib today, hopped into the project and actually explained what the issue had been. But this turned into a fantastic example. I actually wish I could replicate this every semester, because the first thing that I picked as the opening project went from class homework into debugging issues between the paper's use of Matplotlib and subtle updates and subtle bugs in Matplotlib itself. And we actually ended up basically with a Matplotlib fix. And the author responded back and connected with us on the GitHub repo and on the Matplotlib box. So it was a lovely example of open collaboration with these kinds of tools that connected sort of the running of interactive tools all the way down to fully reproducible scientific papers. We used the GitHub Classroom tools. I think these have evolved quite a bit. These slides are actually from when I taught the course. So my understanding is that GitHub Classroom has evolved quite a bit, but it's basically a tool that helps you manage a group of students who are all doing things on GitHub and submitting projects and reviewing and to review them and whatnot. It wasn't perfect at the time, but it did get the job done. I wouldn't use it on a 1,200 person course unless it has changed a lot. But for a small to medium sized course like this one with about 60 students, it was manageable, and for certain things it was great to have the students doing all of their work on GitHub directly. So the workflow that the students had was that their repos had to have an environment.yaml file which describes their dependencies. This is one of these things called a conda environment, and a make file that would automatically run and execute the code that they had created, and that's what we would grade them on. Basically, can we rerun your code? The formatting on this slide is terrible. I moved them over to Google Slides to make it easier to share, but I didn't get to update every one of them because I got distracted with the Anderson's cool new demo today. But anyway, forgive me the painful jumping of font sizes. I have no idea how that, well, Keynote to PowerPoint to Google Slides. It's a miracle that anything survived. And after this, and doing all of these exercises of absorbing these skills, the students ended up doing, as a final project, an original analysis where they had to either provide the data or make it accessible. They had to have code that had tests. They had to provide analysis notebooks and the supporting code broken into little library modules. There was a main narrative notebook that was not meant to be the details of every figure, but actually sort of the whole story. There had to be support for reproducibility. There had to be good practices in terms of open science, things like a README and an explicit license and whatnot. There's a great paper by Victoria Stodden called "Enabling Reproducible Research" that offers some best practices in this regard. And this is what I would call a bit of sort of a standard playbook for sharing your work. If you do all these things, you can share your work kind of in an end-to-end way that is both consumable and checkable by machines and much more easily consumable by humans. This is an example from one of the students from the work that they did. This is the README. It has links to be launched on Binder. It's something that I've mentioned, and we're going to get back to it soon. And they had the README provided an explanation of what the project, that repository, is about. It's not the paper, it's an explanation. It's basically a landing page. There are analysis notebooks that create all of the figures. There's code, there's tests for the code, and there's an actual basically paper that pulls in figures from the analysis notebooks and presents this now as a scientific story. So this is what you could think of as the paper. This was an undergraduate who did this. We had really good feedback. Students who basically got involved with open source contribution, and there was a student who started contributing to open source projects. There was a student who ended up doing his undergraduate research thesis project with me, following his interest in kind of using these practices and his interest in econometrics. And so he was co-supervised by me and others. This was feedback from a journalist, from somebody who is now who is a journalist and who is now basically got reinterested or reoriented in her professional interests to go a little bit deeper into data science. She came from a journalism background and became very interested in connecting these ideas to basically data intensive journalism. And she's now a PhD grad student at Columbia's data science program in New York. So this was for me very, very satisfactory that we could actually teach sort of the what, the why, and the how, giving them a very actionable sort of template for best practices, and good coverage of the tools and the skills as well, so that hopefully they get both the big picture and some usable skills that they can take with them. It is true that some of them struggled a little bit and they got lost in the details. That does happen. We had a very heterogeneous group in terms of computational background. The course itself was fairly broad. We didn't go very deeply in terms of issues of statistical analysis. We talked a little bit about p-hacking, and we read some of the papers about statistical significance that have caused a lot of sort of debate and discussion in the last few years. Some of them actually coming from the neuroscience community were coming out at the time, and so we spent a little bit of time discussing those, but we didn't go too deeply into that. It was more of a broad coverage and basic skill sets. But I still think it was a very valuable course. I had a great experience. Ironically, it would be hard to replicate at least that fantastic experience with the first project, because we've kind of done that. And I would love to give them, part of what was valuable about that was that it was not a contrived homework set. It was a real problem with a real paper from a third-party scientist that I had no connection to. Now, I've mentioned Binder a couple of times, and I'd like to now spend a few minutes covering what Binder is. These are slides that are kind of coupled together from others in the Binder team. I was part of writing sort of the genesis of the project and working on some of the original grants for it. But today, I do literally zero, other than cheerleading, literally zero on Binder. But I find it to be an extraordinarily important and useful part of our ecosystem. So these folks take all the credit for a collection of these slides. The project, just like Jupyter itself, it's kind of a project in the Jupyter ecosystem. Many of these people contribute to other parts of Jupyter, but it's also a big team effort, and they are the ones who deserve all the credit, as I stated before. the story around Binder has been captured in an absolutely fantastic way in this cartoon by Juliette Tacat, a French cartoonist, who I think in collaboration, I think this was done as part of a workshop at the Turing Institute, made this absolutely fantastic cartoon that I find the best description of Binder, where Jane wrote a paper based on her experiments, and she would like. So let me stop for a second before we dive into this. Are there any plans to launch such a course on Coursera? Well, I don't have any right now because my immediate plan is to survive the fall semester with Data 100, which is an upper division core data science course at Berkeley that I have to teach for 1,200 students, and it has to be online. And so you're looking at me with like proper panel lights and SLR and proper microphones and whatnot, because that course will likely go on, Data 100 will likely eventually become some kind of online properly video edited course. So that needs to be my focus right now. I would love to return to this class. I taught it in 2017. I haven't had a chance to reteach it. I have all the materials, and now with the perspective that I have, I would absolutely love to return to it. But unfortunately, it's not on my immediate calendar. It may happen within 2 years or so. I think I'll try to return to that course, but in the spring I'm teaching a course on statistical methods for the physical sciences that I need to create, and so eventually this one I think will come back to my roster. But between these 1,200 students data science courses and these new ones on physics, I'm a little bit overloaded for the next year, so I'm very sorry. And that's just speaking for myself. It's perfectly possible that someone else has plans for something like this. And all my materials are online on the repo. There's links in the slides to my materials. And some of them are original from me. A lot of it is actually cobbled together, as I said, just linking to work done by others in the community. And so there are a number of people who have done fantastic work in this space. I just kind of assemble them with this particular approach and philosophy, and it seems to have worked well. So thanks for the question. I'd love to return to it, and I hope I will. So back to Jane's cartoon, she describes her experiments as a notebook, as a Jupyter notebook, precisely with the approach that we've taken. She publishes them to GitHub, and she makes sure that effectively she follows sort of this playbook that we've been talking about, of having the notebooks, having the other resources available, having the configuration and dependencies be explicitly indicated. That means the repository is what we call binder ready. That GitHub repository is binder ready, because binder is a tool that if Jane's repository has been created following these practices, she clicks on one link and she can give now a new version, a new link that instead of showing people her repository in kind of a bare code fashion, will show them a live executable version of the code, and we'll see what that means. So the motivation for Binder is basically to really give the community the tools to do open source science, to embody that quote by David Donahoe from way back when, which means that people need not just access to the tools, they need an interface that will facilitate exploration and creation. They need a way to communicate that work easily and to share it easily, to wrap it up and bundle it and to deploy that to others, and to do that easily, to do that without having to become massive software engineers. So it's not just about making the work reproducible from a purely technical standpoint, that yes, the code is there if you know how to put it together, but it's to make that practical for working everyday scientists who are not interested and should not be interested in becoming full-time software engineers. And so we have sort of the layers of analysis and visualization, which, as I've mentioned, could be in Python, but they could be in R or any other ecosystem, Julia. Tools for interacting with your environment. It could be Jupyter, it could be RStudio. You can share that, whether it's GitLab, GitHub, or any other code hosting service. And machinery to wrap all that up into something that can be executed. And there, a key piece of technology that has come on the scene, many of you have probably heard of it, but not necessarily all of you, is called Docker. Docker is a tool that makes it, that we'll revisit in a minute, that makes it easy to effectively bundle computational systems and share them with others. And one important point about Binder is that it is not only the tool itself is open source, it is open and driven by the needs of the community. Binder is not a startup that is trying to give you the proprietary version, the proprietary plugin on top of cloud computing tools to share your work. It is a tool that is 100% open source, all the way down to the bottom, driven by the community, developed just like Jupyter itself in the open, because we feel that science, these principles are important enough that they should be part of the open core of science. So the mission of Binder can be summarized as tools for giving you live computational environments that run in the cloud and that are built from your research repositories. And so, as I said, it's 100% open source. It uses fairly fancy cloud computing technology. The people who have built Binder are definitely have become pretty good experts at the software engineering of cloud computing. But the idea is that they've done that so that you don't need to. Because it is for researchers, for educators, for data scientists, for people like you. It's actually a combination of projects. It uses Jupyter Hub, the tool that you've already been logging into and that I used to log into that NCAR. So when I logged into the NCAR site, I was using the NCAR Jupyter Hub, which allows you to log into a shared resource that runs Jupyter services. But under the hood, it uses something called repo2docker to take that GitHub repository that you've created and wrap it into what's called a Docker container. Then there's a layer that's called Binder Hub that makes it possible to share these Jupyter Hub sessions. And then it actually runs a public service. So this is back a little bit to where we began with the fact that at the very top of the pyramid, there has to be a service that makes it accessible to all of you. Here's a lovely example of some of the impact of Binder. Back in 2017, you may recall that the Physics Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery of gravitational waves. This was a prediction made by Einstein back in 1916. I've been talking for a while, so I'm not going to dive into the details too much, but it was a theoretical prediction that proved to be that if a massive gravitational event happened in the universe, like say the explosion of a supernova or the collapse of two black holes into one another, these gravitational events would radiate energy, and that energy would travel in the form of a gravitational wave, which is a stretching and squeezing of space-time itself, and that would travel at the speed of light because of this little C right here. So it's a phenomenon of a wave that travels not unlike light, which is an electromagnetic wave that travels through space and time. But while an electromagnetic wave is a field, is a propagation of electric and magnetic fields through space and time, this is propagation of a distortion of space and time itself. Turns out that even though the prediction was made in 1916, the observation of these took about 100 years. It's extremely hard to make. We don't have time to go into the details, but it was a feat of science and engineering to create a detector that would be able to sense these. That detector is called LIGO, and it's actually a set of two instruments, one in eastern Washington state and one in Louisiana, that have to solve a very, very, very tricky measurement problem, which is to detect a motion of the size of roughly 1/1000th of the size of a proton relative to a distance of about 4 kilometers. So what these instruments are interferometers that have a laser here in the corner. That laser is split into two, and it shines back and bounces back and forth down these two beams, down these two arms that are 4 kilometers each. And if space and time itself stretches, the length of these arms will change differentially, and that difference can be detected because of the interference pattern of the laser light coming back here. You need two of them because just about anything will cause ripples and waves into one of them. Somebody walking down the street, a truck going by miles away, somebody dropping a hammer at their home in the next county over will probably cause ripples that are bigger than the signal you're trying to detect. And so you need at least two of them, if not more, that are well separated spatially to start doing the analysis. And so Binder, which is this tool that, as we've said, turns a GitHub repo into a collection of interactive notebooks. That, by the way, I should have mentioned, originated in neuroscience. Jeremy Freeman, who used to be a neuroscientist, he now is working on climate change, but used to be at Janelia Farm. We had a meeting one time and we talked about how some of the Jupyter tools were almost ready to make it easy to share work that was already on GitHub, but there were a few barriers, and Jeremy and an engineer in his lab came back within a month with a prototype of Binder, and then over time it was funded, and a much bigger community grew to make it a sustainable and large-scale software, both software project and organization, as we'll see in a minute. And so by having something that has these characteristics that we've described, the environment, the repositories, the explicit dependencies, and the tools to deploy that in the cloud. So Docker is effectively a little like sort of computer in a file, virtual machine in a file. I know it's not a virtual machine, the underlying technology is different, but let's go with the analogy that it's kind of like a virtual computer wrapped into a file that you can run anywhere. You can run it on your laptop, you can run it on Windows, on a Mac, on Linux, or you can run it in the cloud. And Kubernetes, which is a tool to orchestrate the deployment of these things. Having Binder built, it became possible to actually see these things in action. So this is an example of the gravitational wave, the LIGO Observatory, Gravitational Wave Open Science Center. And if you go here, this is what they offer. They offer Jupyter notebooks that actually are connected to these data. And it is possible for you to click on one of these links and actually be taken to the live version of Binder. So what we've been seeing is we've been talking about the machinery that creates these environments, but actually we have supported by, well, it was fast enough that you didn't actually see. Supported by Google, OVH, GESIS, and the Turing Institute, we have cloud clusters that will actually run that. So this is actually a live version of that I got from clicking, and any of you can go to the Gravitational Wave, the LIGO Open Science Center, and click on that same link, and it'll take a second. And here you get loaded into the actual notebook that analyzes the actual data. You get to choose which event you want. And then if you run for a little while, if you hit Shift Enter, you begin seeing the plots of the gravitational wave analysis from the detection of, in this case, I'm running with the original event from 2015, which was the first observation. And you can basically play with it, you can see it, you can experiment with the actual data analysis processes and libraries and code and data that led to, as I said, the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physics. So this is a screenshot of one of those notebooks, and this is a screenshot of actually the first figure in the main paper from that discovery that was published in 2016, and which was probably going to be one of the most highly cited papers in physics for the foreseeable future. And for us, it's incredibly satisfactory not only to see that this collaboration has made all their work reproducible this way, but actually to know that all of this is powered by NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib, by all of these open tools. Back when I was doing my PhD in physics, I had to justify to everyone why I was using Python, and every talk that I tried to give about this had a bunch of slides of basically advocacy, because this wasn't considered to be real work. And to 20 years later, or 15 years later in this case, to see one of the main kind of most important discoveries in physics to be done with tools that come from our community was one of the most satisfying moments of my professional career. Obviously, they did the research, we didn't, but to have been able to basically provide something that contributed to that kind of work was incredibly rewarding. You can even listen to the sound of. If you click on that binder, you will get. In the interest of time, I'm not gonna slow down for that. But you can actually get to basically play the sound of that event, which in this case was the spiraling collapse of two black holes that totaled about 30 solar masses in total, I think was the total mass. And I believe the ejection was, the energy ejected was in the form of gravitational waves, was roughly 3 solar masses. So I think the 2 black holes collapsed and they spit back out in an explosion, basically about 3 solar masses worth of their total combined mass that radiated in the form of gravitational waves. So for those of you, very quickly, for those of you who are interested in the internals, as I mentioned, it's kind of a composition of layers Repo2Docker is the tool that will give you a deterministic build of a Docker container out of a GitHub repository. So the idea is that if you have a repo, it will make a Docker image. It recognizes existing ways of declaring your environment. It supports many languages, and it's a fairly lightweight, simple command line tool. You install it, you pip install it, you run Jupyter repo2Docker, and you give it the path, either the URL of a public repo or a local GitHub, a Git repo sitting on your machine. And if it has dependencies explicitly declared, it'll bundle them and give you a Docker container that has all those dependencies prepackaged for you. What it's doing is actually, in a sense, sort of not rocket science. It's doing these things for you. It's cloning, it's getting the repo. If it's not local, it's cloning the repo. It will detect what are the things that are required. It'll detect in a variety of formats, and it supports quite a few formats. It'll set up then, it'll create the necessary Docker file that has all of the things that will be needed for that container to run easily for others in the cloud. So it's not just a standard Docker file, it's a customized special Docker file. It will assemble out of the environment. It'll run your things. It actually gives you tools to fine tune how the build happens and whatnot. It's not limited to running kind of a bare environment that says, I need these libraries. You can actually do pretty much whatever you want in the build. It'll build it. It'll push it. It'll push it to the cloud. It does all that for you. It recognizes dependencies, not just in Conda format, which is what, for example, in my course, I only focused on Python using Conda. Binder actually recognizes requirements in a variety of ways. Which means you can do pretty much anything you want, including writing the Docker file yourself. You can sort of say, I don't want any of the automation. I need to do something complicated enough that I need to write the Docker file myself. And you can use it to build your own environments with arbitrary Docker files. You can run your own UI. The interface doesn't have to be Jupyter Notebooks. It could be JupyterLab. It could be RStudio. It could be something else. And because it is a Docker container, you can run that for testing on basically anywhere that runs Docker. So it could be locally or in the cloud, but it will, if you want it to, it will put it on a Jupyter Hub that is deployed interactively for you in the cloud. And it will actually run that in a kind of scalable, generic, orchestrated way using a tool called Kubernetes, which is a tool for basically running Docker containers at scale in the cloud. Now, Kubernetes is its own kind of layer of complex engineering. I'm not an expert in Kubernetes. I've never written a single Kubernetes recipe or file or a bit of code, but I don't have to, because that layer of deployment is not a layer that I need to right now deal with. And so I build my containers, I tweak them. Sometimes I do custom things to share what I need, and Binder does the rest and does the orchestration for me. So here's a little recent fun example of an interaction that I had with the core Python team. So Guido van Rossum, who's the original author of Python, had posted a new proposed idea for the Python language for version 3.10 of Python called PEP 622, which adds a rather complex syntactic extension to the language that was a little bit tricky to wrap your head around. And so what I did was I said, well, I went to the repo that Guido had, which is called Patma in his GitHub repo, and I said, why don't we add Binder support to this repo that implements the idea? Because it's called structural pattern matching. And my argument was, well, this idea is kind of complex to wrap your head around, and it would be more productive to have a discussion if people could play with it. But it turns out that to play with it, you have to build a very specific version of Python 3.10 alpha. To give you a sense, Python 3.9 hasn't been released. So you have to go and fetch the source repo for Python 3.10, and you have to fetch a very specific branch, which is not even in the CPython organization, but somebody else is, one of his colleagues is developing, this fellow, Brand Bucher is the one who's developing, who has the implementation. So you have to go grab the exact branch of 3.10, build it, make sure that you get the build right, and then you can try to play with these ideas. And I think the focus of Guido and Brand and others right now is not on the build process. What they're interested in is feedback around whether the idea works or not. So I said, why don't we do this? I got it started. Then folks like Tim Head, who's one of the leads on Binder, and Chris Holdgraf, who is a neuroscientist who works at UC Berkeley and is also one of the leads on the Binder project, and Matthias Buissonnier, who I mentioned created originally the notebook viewer. They all jumped in to help me because there were weird issues. This was not a trivial Binder to build because it required a custom build of Python itself, but Binder, the Jupyter Hub runs on Python, and it doesn't run on Python 3.10, so we had to add a custom version of Python so that without breaking the running of the Binder itself. They very kindly helped me over the span of like 2 days. And we were able to provide a playground, the PEP 622 playground, which is basically a simple notebook that is guaranteed to run. It checks that it's running on 3.10. It has a simple toy example, and Guido posted on the Python developers mailing list the links to this so that people could now have hopefully a more informed discussion. So this, I wanted to show this one partly because I had a lot of fun doing this a few weeks ago, but also to illustrate that it enables reproducibility enables collaboration. It enables making something like this easily reproducible with one click, makes it easy to collaborate, for a community to collaborate, in this case, on a complex technical discussion around a new feature for the Python language, rather than in the abstract. And hopefully this has been valuable to them and the team. Now, at the other extreme, there's something like this figure, which is where The Economist committed to beginning to publish the analysis that underlied some of their important articles and whatnot to the general public, and to make them available in the form of notebooks and enable you to run them online. So this is sort of, I wanted to not only have a scientific example such as the one from the black hole gravitational wave discovery, but also these two that are from software engineering and from just engagement with the general public at the level of journalism, to show that these tools enable sort of discussion and collaboration and hopefully more informed discourse across a variety of sort of dimensions of the human experience, not just scientific research and academic publishing. Now, just to wrap up, it turns out that running a service is complicated. Binder is a complex and rapidly growing service. Today, Binder has on the order of 150,000 weekly sessions. They cost, I'm sorry that these figures are not super large. I probably should have made this in 2 slides. There's a link here actually to the repo that has, so this is actually available to you on a repos, and you can view it. So all of Binder publishes all of their code and data is available publicly. But they cost about, this is 0.02 basically in dollars. So basically about 2 cents per session. So this is not a trivial exercise to run this in the cloud. Today, Google Cloud, OVH, which is a French cloud provider, On vous héberge, Jessis Notebooks, and the Turing Institute in the UK all provide basically clusters. And when you go to Binder, you don't know where you get a notebook, because what you will get is one of the containers in one of these nodes of the federation. But the point is, we're trying to work with a community-driven federated model rather than making this a single point of access that, say, a company controls. I think this matters because, as perhaps a number of you are aware of, there are big battles right now between the publishing industry and the scientific communities. The UC system that I'm a part of just recently canceled our contracts with Elsevier. We don't have access to Elsevier journals anymore as of this year in the UC system. In Europe, Plan S has been pushing also very hard the publishers to make their publications available. And the next frontier beyond access to those PDFs that you get, you have to set up your VPN now that you're working from home so that you can download them, because otherwise they try to charge you $39.95 for every PDF that you want to read. Those PDFs are in a sense last year's battle, because the real future of these battles with these very large commercial entities around open access to science is going to be not around PDFs, but around the rest of the research, which is the computation and the codes and the data. And I think it's important that the scientific community has a stake and has a strong stake in that, rather than leaving the development of these ideas to commercial providers. So in any case, I hope this overview that kind of started with purely interactive exploration and tried to connect it to the values of reproducibility as a foundation both for collaboration and of the scientific enterprise were useful. I think we still have about 15, slightly less than 15 minutes, and I'm happy to take other questions if there are any, and if not, I'm happy to return later to Slack if something comes to mind later. I'm on the Academy Slack, and I'm happy to watch it for the next few days. But thank you so much again to the organizers for inviting me and for allowing me to speak, and for all of you for kind of sticking around for almost 2 hours. I'm sure you're tired, and those of you who have to go to bed and who are in other time zones, I appreciate it. I don't know if these will be recorded and made available later. I will share a link to the slides shortly.